There's no denying that racing and being competitive is part of our DNA. But did you know that one very special race changed the way we travel even today? This race proved once and for all that steam locomotion was the most innovative way to move forward. Of course, I'm talking about the Rainhill Trials. But before we meet the contenders for this great race, let's have a little background. In the early 1800s, the UK saw a boom in industry and factories were being built up and down the country. One of the most precious commodities was cotton. These peculiar little plants would be farmed in the Americas by the tonnage and shipped to the UK to be processed. Manchester quickly became a massive cotton manufacturer. But just as the demand for cotton grew, the manufacturers had a problem. Manchester had to rely heavily on ports such as Liverpool, but there was no reliable transport links between the two. Roads were dangerous and slow, and the canal traders monopolised the transport industry, but they too were slow, and the barges had to be pulled by horses. In fact, it would take longer for cotton to travel from Liverpool to Manchester by barge than it did to bring the cotton from the Americas to Liverpool. Change was needed, and needed rapidly, and the answer came from an unlikely source. The mining industry had been using tracks and rails for years with small pit ponies providing the power to move the heavy wagons. A local engineer and inventor called George Stephenson drew on this idea of using smooth metal rails to move loads. Unlike canals, tracks were affordable, easy to lay, maintain, and more importantly, just as easy to remove. Inspired by this, George Stephenson got to work and created the Liverpool to Manchester Railway. The 31 miles of tracks had to cover some of the most arduous terrain in the UK. One of the trickiest terrain was a large bog, over 4 miles across. With no way around it, Stephenson laid timber in a herringbone layout and used over 70,000 cubic feet of soil to try and stabilise the rails on top and hold the weight of the train. It was rumoured that one part of the bog was so deep, one contractor kept soil in there for a solid 3 months without finding the bottom. Eventually, through careful implementation of careful drainage systems, a lot of hard standing, even filling tar barrels with clay, and 64 bridges later, the tracks were completed. One only other problem remained, and that was how to power the wagons. Some people suggested horsepower like they have in the pits. This wasn't new. The railways in Swansea were horse-drawn, and this was also popular in Europe. But the directors of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway wanted to use stationary steam engines and ropes to haul the trains along the tracks. However, the line's creator George Stephenson had other ideas. Stephenson issued a challenge. He offered £500 to any engineer who could create a machine which could prove once and for all that a steam locomotive would be the best solution to pull the heavy trains. But George implemented specific rules. Each engine will be filled with water and must be weighed at the start. It will then be given a load 3 times the engine's weight and be given enough fuel and water to make a journey of 35 miles. The engine will be started and the amount of fuel and water consumed will be noted. If the engine had a tender, that would also be considered as part of the load. If the engine carried its own fuel and water, then the weight of the fuel and water would be deducted from the load. The engine will be pushed to the starting post, and as soon as the steam is up to 50 pounds per square inch, the engine can start. Each engine with its load will travel 1 3/4 miles each way, which 1.5 miles will be at full speed and will make 10 trips, which is the equivalent to a journey of 35 miles. The engine will not fall below 10 miles an hour during this journey. As soon as this journey is completed, fresh fuel and water will be delivered, and the engine will make a further 10 trips. And the time in between trip 1 and trip 2 will be monitored. The engine must run on Stephenson's gauge track, today known as Stanley gauge. With the rules set, the venue booked, and the gauntlets drawn, all they needed was the contenders. Surprisingly, there wasn't that many, but the ones that did show up we can look at in more detail. The first one to the gate was a very unusual engine, if you would call it that. It was built by Thomas Shaw Brandreath, who was one of the railway directors. This was the only engine in the trials that did not use steam, and instead relied on tried and trusted horsepower. This was Cycloped. The horse is attached to a treadmill, which powers the wheels underneath. While it didn't meet all of the requirements of the rules, the people were intrigued and wanted to see this peculiar engine work. Thomas himself was very eager to prove his invention worked, as he was an advocate for horse-drawn power and was very vocal that the new steam engines could put some people in the horse trades out of work. Amazingly, this contraption worked, albeit slowly, managing only 5 miles an hour, and I can't imagine it was fun for the poor horse. Fortunately for Cycloped, it was forced to retire not long after it started, due to the horse falling through the treadmill. The second engine was the first serious contender to the trial. It was the first steam-powered engine and weighed in at an impressive 2.9 tons. Built by John Reed Hills and Timothy Burstall's, she was called Perseverance. This engine had gone through a lot to get to the trials. She got damaged on the way when her wagon overturned, and her owners had to spend 5 days getting her repaired and race ready. Perseverance set off briskly. However, she settled to a steady 6 miles an hour. Unfortunately, breakdowns and mechanical failures, as well as the disappointing performance of the engine, caused Burstall to throw in the towel. The judges took pity on him, and for his efforts gave Perseverance a consolation prize of £25. It was then the turn of the first engine that used a tender. It was constructed by Timothy Hackworth and it was called Sam's Pariel. This monster engine weighed in at over 4 tons and was almost not allowed to compete due to its gargantuan size. This twin-cylinder engine drove the front driving wheels with a coupling rod to help power the back two, and was rumoured that the blast from her blast pipe was so strong it expelled the fuel out of her chimney. Sam's Pariel set off with a good pace and a ton of strength, and was the first real shot at completing the course. After 8 impressive trips, she stopped in a blaze of steam as her cylinder broke. Despite her setback, Sam's Pariel showed her potential, and she was purchased by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, then leased to the Bolton and Leigh Railway, before going on to be used as a stationary boiler at the Copial Railway in Chorley until 1863. Thanks to her service and her good efforts, she was preserved in 1864 by now what is known as the Science Museum. The penultimate engine to trial the course was considered to be the first ever tank engine. Built by John Ericsson and John Braithwaite, the 022 engine was called Novelty. And novelty it was, as it was the crowd's favourite to win the coveted £500 prize. Novelty's designers rumoured to have drawn inspiration on Novelty's design from horse-drawn fire engines and steam pumps, and was made race-ready in only 7 weeks. She was built in London and considered one of the lightweights in the competition. Ericsson had designed what was known as a forced draft system, which meant that air could be forced directly into the fire, giving it more heat, and that the draft is proportional to the speed of the engine, making it highly efficient. So with the crowd behind her, she set off. And off she did go. Novelty raced down the track at an astonishing 28 miles an hour, This had never been heard of from a machine, and straight away the masses were impressed. But once again, the course proved too arduous for the engine to cope with, and Novelty broke down. The judges, who were running out of contenders at this point, gave her another chance following repairs. However, it was too much, and Novelty 2 was forced to withdraw following a crack in her feed pipe. With 4 out of the 5 engines out of the race, all hopes were now pinned on the final contender. Built by George Stephenson's own son Robert Stephenson and company, the crowds gathered to watch Rocket make her grand debut on the tracks. Rocket had been made in complete secrecy, and it was believed to be by George's own command to show that steam locomotives were going to be better than the stationary steam engines that they were due to have on the railway. Robert had used a unique design in the boiler, comprising, instead of having 1 or 2 singular tubes, he added 25 individual tubes, giving more surface area for the heat to act on the water surrounding them. Unlike other engines, he used a single pair of driving wheels with no coupling rods, and the larger wheels meant the cylinders could be more efficient. Rocket was specifically designed for the competition, and her cylinders were on an angle which helped her to stop the vibration and give her passengers a smoother ride. Rocket certainly lived up to her namesake and managed 30 miles an hour consistently. Rocket completed the course with minimal fuss and effort, and even pulled some passengers back on her return route. There was no doubt who the clear winner was. Stephenson proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that locomotives were the way of the future. Rocket went on to have a successful life. Sadly, its opening day on the Liverpool to Manchester line is remembered as a sombre affair. It was the 15th of September 1830. Dignitaries from all over the country descended on the line to celebrate its opening. Among the wealthiest that turned up that day was a gentleman called William Huskinson. He was still recovering from a previous illness, but despite doctors' advice, he wanted to be there at the opening ceremony. He rode a special train pulled by a locomotive called Northumbrian, which George Stephenson himself drove. However, as this engine stopped to take on water, he got out of the carriage and wandered onto the track. Suddenly there was a cry of "Engine approaching! Take care, gentlemen!" and Huskinson panicked. In the confusion, he grabbed the door to a private carriage, but the door swung open and he fell backwards into the path of Rocket. He succumbed to his injuries later that evening. There is a tribute to Huskinson within the museum itself. In the warehouse on the back wall, you will see there is a plaque dedicated to him, and if you do travel on the Manchester to Liverpool line, you will still see his memorial. His memorial stands where the station once stood, but sadly is now no longer accessible due to it being too close to the tracks. In 1862, Rocket was preserved at the Science Museum, and has recently been moved to the National Railway Museum. It stands proudly on its own as its own separate exhibit. So when you're looking at the engine, or if you're lucky enough to ride one of its replicas, imagine the excitement around you at the trials, and thank George and Robert Stephenson for your train ride home today.